So I am Louis Marchesano. I am the Audrey and William Helfand Senior Curator of Prints, Drawings, and Photographs at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, of course, in Philadelphia. Let's start with Sonia Delaney, the project for album cover from 1916. And this is an important work executed when Sonia Delaney and Robert Delaney were in Spain and Portugal during the First World War. And while they were in exile, they produced a whole group of very different kinds of things, in part to make a living, but also in part to continue their experiments with abstraction that they began shortly, a few years before they went into exile. This work is from 1916, and it's an abstract work, and if you look at it closely, you can just about make out the term album. It's a study for an album cover. Sonia Delaney is one of the foremost sort of experimenters of abstraction, and one of the most important women artists of that period. This is a particularly fresh image, done in the characteristic style and also with the characteristic media oil wax on paper. And it is in extraordinary condition. Many of these works from this period have condition issues because of the media. The oil wax tends to dry, crack, and flake. And this is a superb example of a work from that period. The Astronomical Discour by Jacques Bassentin, it's actually James Bassentin, who was a Scotsman, published this large astronomical treatise in Lyon in 1557. It's a magnificent, spectacular, large, beautifully illustrated book on astronomy, and it contains 175 woodcuts and 13 volvelles. These are prints with bits and pieces of moving parts that basically imitate the function of an astrolabe. So they're two-dimensional astrolabes that help you calculate the movement of planets, figure out the time, and other kind of practical things like that. It's a fantastic volume with a wonderful provenance, Mary Queen of Scots. This particular volume, the illustrations are hand-colored. And one of the things that I love about works like this, where you have the confluence of art and science coming together at the moment, at the sort of the middle of the scientific revolution, you have the confluence of art and science, and they're so spectacular that most people will look at them and be amazed without really understanding what they're looking at. You could read the text to determine how the astrolabes work, but they're impressive as works of art in their own right. Third piece, Party Guest #1 by Derek Adams, screen print and collage, published in 2020. And Derek Adams is this really fascinating artist because he is part of the lineage of African-American artists who were thinking about figurative art, especially in the 1960s, and the way in which figurative art could be used for two things. One, to represent the tragedy of racism, and two, to produce the uplifting images that can give people a sense, a positive and affirmative sense of African-American life. And Derek Adams' work toggles between those two extremes, and each individual work does. When you look at the work offered by the Long Sharp Gallery, you see a boy with these faceted colors, whose face is constructed of these faceted colors, wearing a party hat with a colorful t-shirt. And you don't really have a sense of his emotional universe. There's something blocked off, sort of disturbing, but also, you want to know what's behind this facade. There's this real tension between the party hat and this kind of blank expression on the boy's face. It seems the whole thing is made up of flat planes of color, faceted bits and pieces of color that held together. And there's this really interesting subtle tension because you feel that it could almost fall apart, if you were just to touch it the wrong way, like a house of cards. And it really expresses the kind of emotional fragility that we're trying to get through through the expression of that boy. The next work, The Miner by the Belgian painter and sculptor Constantin Meunier. Meunier started off as a sculptor, saw Courbet's work in the 1850s and decided to become a painter so that he could deal with the social issues that were important to him and people like Courbet, and then took up sculpture again in the 1880s. And his images and three-dimensional works are of miners, peasants, weavers. It's really a kind of social art. And he's an extraordinary artist. When you look at his paintings, when you look at his sculpture, what you see are these very generalized figures of miners, workers, appear sort of idealized, very general. This is a portrait of an individual. And it's so precise that it's almost uncanny in a way. There's something homoerotic about the image. I think it's the worker, with the shirt over his shoulders, his thumb hooked into his pants or his belt buckle, pulling his pants slightly down so that we have a more fuller sense of his belly. That the attitude, almost haughty, but very powerful attitude, makes it an extraordinary work of art. What I find particularly compelling about this is the technique. Remember, Meunier was trained as a sculptor and worked first and foremost as a sculptor. And even when he's drawing, you have a sense that he's sculpting the figure on paper. Bridget Riley's untitled screen print from 1964 offered by Sims Reed is a classic example of op art. And I'm certain that Bridget Riley would not appreciate being called groovy, but she falls within the groovy category. And that's not to belittle the work of art, but it's to say that her work was so popular during the period and influential with designers, especially clothes designers, that many of them stole her ideas. And she fought rather vigorously to protect her intellectual and artistic property. The thing about Bridget Riley is that she plays with this long tradition of perspective and abstraction that, for me, goes back to Piero della Francesca in the Renaissance, when you have someone who's really very self-conscious about using perspective and doesn't want to hide the fact, like later Renaissance or Baroque artists did, but really wants to show it off in a way and make you think about how space is constructed or how we perceive space on a two-dimensional surface. And Bridget Riley plays with those ideas and forces us to toggle back and forth between looking at these works and trying to really determine what her recipe is for producing these things so that we can really look at them and examine them. And then she snaps us back into this world of illusion and we can't help ourselves. So the Vedute di Roma, the Views of Rome, was produced over about a 30-year period by the printmaker Giovanni Battista Piranesi, who first trained as an architect and then became an archaeologist and then became one of the great printmakers in the Western tradition. And everything that we think we know about Rome, even if it's not true, comes from Piranesi. Later on, when Goethe visited Rome, he was really disappointed because he imagined that Rome was like the way it was represented by Piranesi. The volume that Shapiro Books is offering was bound for Gustav III, the King of Sweden. It has the royal binding. So it has a very good provenance. There are 2 large volumes, and they're fantastic because as you turn the pages, you reveal there's the Piazza of St. Peter, these grand monumental sheets. You turn the next page and there's the Pantheon. You turn the next page and there's the Piazza Sant'Anna del Popolo. And you have this extraordinary tour of this magnificent city that Piranesi immortalized in his prints.